Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're here with Samantha Shannon.
Hi.
All right. So let's get started. We are here to talk about A Day of Fallen Night, the Priory prequel that we were all so excited to read as a Sapph-Lit bonus book this past April. So I have so many questions, but before we start, I want to introduce you to those who may not know all of the work that you've done. So, Samantha Shannon is a New York Times and Sunday Times bestselling author. She was born in West London in 1991 and started writing in abundance when she was 12. She studied English language and literature at St. Anne's College, Oxford from 2010 to 2013, specializing in the poetry of Emily Dickinson and the principles of film criticism. In 2013, at the age of 21, she published The Bone Season, which we were just discussing before we let you all in that the 10-year anniversary edition is coming out. So if you haven't read it, wait to read the 10-year edition, which is the internationally best-selling first installment in a 7-book series of fantasy novels. Her first book outside of this series, The Priory of the Orange Tree, which was our July 2021 fiction pick for Sapph-Lit, the second book we ever read. That was published in 2020, or no, 2019, and then it won the Lambda Literary Award in 2020. So its prequel, A Day of Fallen Night, finally hit shelves in February of 2023, and she is currently revising the Bone Season series for republishing, which is so cool. I've never heard of an author doing that before. But Samantha, welcome. Thank you so much for coming back to chat with us.
Oh, thank you for having me back. I mean, I think I said last time it's so cool to be able to speak to a club that's like specifically about sapphic fiction. I don't think that's something I've done before or since the last time we spoke. So yeah, it's really nice to be here.
Oh, well, honored to have you. So before we start, one thing that we all realized when we were discussing A Day of Fallen Night as a community during one of our Zoom chats is that the people who listen to the audiobook pronounce the names differently than those who read the physical book. So can you clear it up for us? Can you pronounce the names of the main characters so that I don't fuck up for the rest of this interview?
In A Day for a Night.
Yes.
Yeah, so I have not yet listened to the whole audiobook. I think I've just listened to the prologue, I think. Um, and I know that some of the names, weirdly, Audible did ask me how to pronounce some of the names, but they were still not pronounced exactly as I say them. Some of them were, some of them weren't. That tends to be the way with audiobooks. So, for example, in Priory, I say Eid, the audiobook narrator says it Ead, I think. But anyway, doesn't matter. So I say the main characters' names as Wolf, Glorian, Tanuva, and Dumai. And then Tanuva's partner is Esbar, and Dumai's frenemy slash love interest is Nikea.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That is how I was saying them in my head. So I think the audiobook called Dumai or something.
Oh,
Um and I felt a little gaslit.
okay. No, I mean, if that's how the audiobook narrator wants to say it, so be it. I always go with whatever makes you feel comfortable. Most of the names are made up, so it doesn't really matter.
That's true. So first of all, congratulations on publishing this massive feat of a book. I'd love to hear about how this publishing experience differed from that of Priory. And it's also quite a longer timeline than Priory.
Mm.
It's over a significant number of years in comparison, where we see Glorian and CU and Wolf grow up. So I'd love to hear about that experience writing it as well.
Yeah, so this was quite a different beast writing. First of all, I suppose from a personal perspective, because I knew I was sapphic when I wrote this one. I did not know that when I wrote The Priory of the Orange Tree. So it was really born from I did originally intend The Priory of the Orange Tree to be a standalone. I said that to my agent when I pitched it, and he didn't believe that it would be a standalone because he knows me and he knows that I think very deeply about the worlds I occupy, and he suspected I would want to go back to it. And I was pretty insistent on this. But then obviously when I wrote Priory, there's a big period of history between the inciting incident of the book, which is the rise of the Nameless One. And then 1,000 years has gone by between that incident and the events of the book. So obviously that meant I had to create 1,000 years of history. And of course, that was when I came up with the idea of the grief of ages, the great war between dragons and humans. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought it would be a really fascinating period to explore. Because how would humans fight off an army of fire-breathing dragons? It sounds like it's going to be virtually impossible. And there were numerous things that I thought would be challenging and interesting about it. So, for example, we learn in the Priory of the Orange Tree that this period, the grief of ages, was ended by the arrival of a comet. And of course, that's not something the main characters are going to be able to affect. So, how would I write a book that follows a group of characters whose actions do not technically end the story? Something comes from outside to end the story. And I thought that would be interesting because it would be a bit more about survival and endurance than fighting to defeat the enemy. Priory is a bit different. It's like a classic quest fantasy where the characters are collecting items to defeat the enemy. And I knew that couldn't happen in A Day of Fallen Night. So I went back to my agent with my tail between my legs and I said, yeah, it looks like I actually would like to write another book in this world, but I want this one to be a standalone too. And I want it to be a prequel that's like significantly far apart from the Priory of the Orange Tree. So to the point that I didn't feel like I had to have all the pieces exactly where they are in Priory because there's such a huge stretch of time between them. And he said, I'm sure Bloomsbury would love that. And he sent me on my way. And I proposed the idea to Bloomsbury. And they said something along the lines of, we would absolutely love that. Can you try to make it just a little bit shorter? And
which it's longer.
It's longer. It doesn't look longer because I think Bloomsbury accepted defeat and they made the paper just slightly thinner. So it looks deceptively shorter, but it is not. It's actually about 30,000 words longer, I think, which is big number of words. And the first draft of it was huge. It was 345,000 words long. So for context, the current finished book is about 290. And it was just growing and growing and growing. And that was partly, like you say, because this book takes place over such a long period of time. It takes place over 4 years, or actually more like 3.5. But it follows, again, like Priory, 4 characters. It also has an additional group of narrators who do not tell most of the story, but some of it, and they also, extended the size. There's an epilogue and a prologue, which is a narrative technique I do not always think is appropriate, but I did for this book. So yeah, it just grew into this this monstrous read, and I was very grateful that Bloomsbury, let me publish it to the site. We did cut it down a lot, but my editor is quite clever in that she didn't really cut out big chunks of it. It was more like very slowly chipping away at lots of small things. So a lot of people say to me stuff like, well, did you cut out huge scenes? And I said, well, no, not really. It was mostly just my editor perhaps carving down, do you need this many words to describe what kind of gown somebody is wearing or what they're eating or whatever, which I 90% of the time I probably didn't need. So yeah, that's the story of how it came to be, I suppose. And I think I was very fortunate in that Priory of the Orange Tree was received with so much love and support, and that helped, let this happen.
Yeah. When I was in London recently, the first Waterstones that I went to, I walked in and there was a massive Day of Fallen Night display. And I was with my best friend and was like, oh my God, I'm talking to Samantha. I was freaking out to see it in person because I hadn't seen it in a bookstore before in the States.
Yeah, Waterstones has been very supportive of it. Like they did a special edition, which has a bonus chapter, as did Barnes and Noble, which was really fun because I haven't actually written a bonus chapter for a book before, and I got to have more of my Sapphic couple, Esbar and Tanuva, which was fun.
I should have gotten that fucking edition when I was in London.
Yeah, you can get the Barnes and Noble one, but yeah, there's like an extra scene which is about Tanuva and Esbar's courtship and when they decide to officially embark on a relationship, which was actually really, really fun to write.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, I'm gonna go to Barnes and Noble later today, so that's my mission. I also remember when you were writing it and revising it, sharing how your Word document kept crashing because it was so long.
Oh my God, I had no idea that could happen. I think the thing you're talking about is, and I posted this on Instagram, was I was working on Word, and I think the problem was it was the combined size of the manuscript plus my editor's comments and the track changes and stuff like that. Word just could not cope with it. And it just flashed up this message that literally said something like, Word cannot handle the document and is closing. And I just thought Word is designed to process. That is its only function. And I've written such a huge novel that it cannot fulfill that basic function. And it was just, it was like a wake up moment, but also one of the funniest things that's ever happened to me. So I've now switched to Scrivener, which so far has not collapsed on me. Admittedly, I haven't tried Scrivener with a Roots of Chaos book yet. I'm working on my 5th Bone Season book on Scrivener, but so far it's holding out. But we'll see what happens when I eventually write Roots of Chaos 3.
Oh my God. Well, let's put a pin in that because that is going to get later into my questions. The continuation of the Roots of Chaos now series, but they're still standalones and you can still read them individually. So one thing that Veronica and I noticed when reading this was you write from a lot of different age perspectives. And this was the same in Priory, but there was a bit more range, I feel, with A Day of Fallen Night. You have Tuva at age 50, Glorian and young Wolf, like teenagers, young adults, and then a 30-year-old Dumai. How did you get into the mindsets of these different ages?
That's a really interesting question. So, I mean, it was easier with some than others. So, obviously, with Glorian, I have been a 15-year-old girl, and Glorian is very similar to me in a lot of ways. So, Glorian, she does not want to get married or have children, but it is something that is expected of her as the future Queen of Innis. And we saw a lot of this kind of wrestling with the character of Sabran in the Priory of the Orange Tree, but this time we got to go into this Berethnic queen's head and feel what it is like to be in that position. So Glorian was pretty easy because I was very similar when I was 15. I didn't want to get married or have children. I still don't. So a lot of Glorian's lines feel like things that I was thinking at the time. Like there's a line where she talks about why could she not want as others wanted? Because when I was younger, I was very insecure about the fact that I did not want to have a partner or have kids. I felt like it made me, I don't know, broken in some way. Like people found it very odd and they would always say things like, oh, you'll change your mind, that sort of thing. So a lot of that feeling was poured into Glorian, and it was both a lovely and a very raw experience to step back into being my 15-year-old self, because I was incredibly insecure at that time of my life, and I feel like that is very much reflected in Glorian. Wolf is obviously a little bit older than Glorian, but I have obviously never been a man of that age. I didn't find it too difficult to write Wolf. He's definitely the least similar to me of all the characters. Like we really don't have a lot of shared experiences, apart from the fact that he has quite a blended family, which was important to me to portray because, you know, I have like a stepfather and a half brother, and I think those kinds of families should be celebrated more in fiction. So I wanted to give Wolf this really healthy blended family. So that was fun, and it felt like that was the experience he shares with me. Otherwise, we're not similar at all. I wish I was as cool as Wolf, but I'm not. So Dumai is, like you say, she's 30 at the end of the book. She starts off at 27, which is about the same age I was when I started A Day of Fallen Night. So I felt very, very close to Dumai during the process of writing the book. And obviously a lot of it was drawn from my own experience of being that age, and also critically being that age and figuring out my sexuality. So Dumai knows that she's a lesbian from quite a young age, but she has suppressed it because she is totally laser focused on achieving her dream of being the maiden officiant, so the leader of her religious community like her mother is. So she has pretty much crushed all sense of personal desire or any ambition other than achieving that goal. And the process of writing her was still quite wonderful in that sense, because although she did not have exactly the same experience as me, I felt like it was about getting in touch with your sexuality in your late 20s. So a lot, you know, other Sapphic women I've spoken to have said that they knew from a really young age, and I didn't. So I suppose I was able to explore through Dumai what it is like to have that realization at that point in your life. So that was great, and a lot of it is from personal experience. And then there's Tanuva. I have obviously not been a 50-year-old woman. So once again, I was having to draw on my imagination to some extent, but it was very important to me that in this book, there would be a female character who was in her 50s. Part of the reason for that, so I've always thought it's important to write characters who are older than what I might call the average protagonists. Like it's quite rare in fiction even now that you see main characters who are much older than their 20s. I mean, it does happen, but especially for women, I think there could be a lot better representation. And I would have a lot of conversations with my mum, who is, I think, 57 now. But we had a lot of conversations about the invisibility of women after a certain age in the media. And this was brought up, I think, last year. Like there was a group of British actors who signed a petition asking for better representation of women over 40, because it does feel like there's this idea that after a certain age, as women start to lose this stereotypical idea of beauty, that our opinions and thoughts are less valued and that we start to just disappear, except for being kind of stereotyped, like, I don't know, older, like positions of being a mother, but kind of an invisible mother in the background. So I really wanted to write this sapphic couple who were in their 50s, and it was quite important to me that they had got together a while ago, and also that they had both had children, but again, a while ago, because often I feel like marriage and children are presented as being the end of a woman's story. They're the happy ending that we're supposed to all be working towards. And I wanted to explore a character who was a mother and was in a happy relationship, but that was just a part of her story. It's a very important part, and say it's a bedrock of Tanuva's life, but it's not what she's aiming towards. I wanted to show that there is more beyond that point. It's just a part of your journey. And again, I really wanted to give proper visibility to women in their 50s, and a lot. So I spoke a lot to my mum about, especially about the experience of how menopause is represented. I wanted both Tanuva and Esbar to be experiencing the menopause, and they're experiencing it in slightly different ways, and just normalizing it. Like I've tried very hard to do that in all of my work, normalizing things like menopause, like periods. I tried to do very realistic depictions of childbirth. So I spoke to a lot of my friends who are mothers to try to nail that as much as I could. And yeah, it was just very important to me to do that in this book, especially because I had an older character in Priory, a male character, Nicolaes. And I know Nicolaes, I think he's probably the bottom of the popularity list for all of my characters. A lot of people do not like Nicolaes, but for me, no, I get it. But he's not really written to be like, to be fair, but for me as an author, he was an incredibly fun character to write because he's 64, so he has all of this life experience to draw on, and that makes him very interesting and layered character for me to imagine how he would have changed from being a young man through to being the age he is now. And it was really important to me that this time I did that, but with a female character, and that was how Tanuva was created.
Yeah, I love I just love everything you just said. And it's so interesting to hear how you see yourself in these characters. And I think, I mean, you said you've never done a prologue before in your work either, which the prologue in this is introducing these characters as mothers and as daughters largely. And there's such a strong theme of motherhood throughout this book. There's Gloria and Sabrin, Nora, Canth, Siu, Tuva, Espar. And then you have Wolf's lack of a motherly figure. And then he ends up with two, which is, I was crying, may I say. So why did you choose motherhood to be so central to A Day of Fallen Night? And what did you want to convey with these maternal relationships?
So it started actually as it felt appropriate for this particular book because the central event of this book is the eruption of the volcano called the Dreadmount, and it literally births life in the form of the worms. So in a way, it is about the earth itself giving birth and the consequences of that. And so motherhood, I've always wanted to write a book that deeply explores motherhood, but this felt like the right book to do that because it had that thematic tie with the setting and the epic conflict of the book. And so I could use that epic conflict to be the reflection of some of the smaller and more intimate conflicts in the book. And with motherhood, as I mentioned with Glorian's storyline, the idea of motherhood was something that really shaped some of my earlier years, especially because I was raised Christian. So there was a lot about, this kind of background sense of what a woman's purpose is and be fruitful and increase in number, all that sort of thing. And I really did find that I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin because of that threat. It felt like a threat often to me, this idea that I had to get married, I had to have children. And I felt like I was every time someone would mention it, I felt like I was in a cage and I had to escape from it. It probably didn't help that I hadn't figured out I was gay at the time. So most of the romantic interest I was getting actually all of it was from guys. So yeah, it would have helped to work that out at an earlier age, but I didn't. So yeah, I just felt like it was something that hung over my teen years and my 20s. And then I'm now in my 30s and I feel like I'm just way more comfortable with it. I'm very happily content in the fact that I don't want to get married and have kids. But I feel like a lot of women at some point in our lives have to wrestle with that question. Do we want children or not? Do we want to be mothers? And of course, for some of us, it isn't a choice. And I suppose I somewhat explored that through the character of Tanuva, who was a mother and then was not, or she feels like that was taken away from her, which it was, and how she deals with that. But fundamentally, I wanted to explore lots of different perspectives on motherhood. So it was important to me to have a character like Glorian and also like Dumai, who share my views on motherhood and that they don't want to have children. And the outcomes of those two stories are different. One in a way that I found quite tragic. But it was also important to me to celebrate women who do want to be mothers and are mothers, and all the different complexities and difficulties of motherhood and the challenges of it. So one of the ways I explored that was through Esbar and Tanuva, who are both maternal figures to Siyu. Esbar is her biological mother. Tanuva is a kind of adopted mother figure to her. And I was fascinated by how that might intersect with the rules of the Priory of the Orange Tree, which is a matriarchy, but because it's essentially one big family, the birth mothers of the children are encouraged to not have a particularly close relationship with them because they don't want to seem like they're favoring their own children. So Esbar has had to have quite a distant relationship from Siyu, and she's quite harsh on Siyu because Siyu represents her line, her bloodline. They are descended from Siati Uknara, who is also an ancestor of Eid in the Priory of the Orange Tree, and they are a very respected bloodline in the Priory of the Orange Tree. So Esbar feels like Siyu, her behavior reflects on her. But Tanuva is much softer with Siyu. She has this more complicated relationship because she lost her own biological child. And so her relationship with Siyu is definitely affected by that. So I just wanted to write a novel that dealt very diversely with motherhood, lots of different perspectives, like just an intense study of it, I suppose. And most importantly, one that did not judge a woman's choices when it came to motherhood. Because again, I don't want children and I expect that to be respected. But I also respect women who do want children, who do have children. And there are so many amazing mothers I know personally, like not just my own mum, but friends of mine who are mothers. And I wanted to celebrate them as well. So I just hope it's like a well-rounded portrayal of motherhood.
100%. That definitely came across. And yeah, I loved how and we'll get into this a bit later, with Dumai and with Glorian, the conversation around not wanting to have a child was so refreshing. And yeah, we'll get into it later. I have a question about that. So in comparison to Priory, A Day of Fallen Night is definitely a bit spicier,
Yes.
which we love. I love. What was that like for you? Because the writing is so poetic, and you're like, oh my God, I'm like, this is like turning me on, but I'm also like, oh my God, what a beautiful description.
Thank you. Those scenes probably actually get the most work from me because I really want them to be beautiful. And I'm always very hesitant to whether I call my books spicy or not, because they are, in my opinion, quite spicy. But the way I write them can sometimes, I suppose, be a little bit vague and skirting around the subject. Like, I want to make it clear what is happening, but perhaps not too explicitly, because I don't personally find that sexy. I think that leaving a bit to the imagination that's kind of what I aim to do. So I suppose that's why there's so much poetry in it. It's kind of trying to conceal what's happening while letting you know what's happening, and that can be quite a difficult balance to execute. So yeah, those are the scenes that I will go over many times, like trying to find the exact correct word, the exact rhythm that I want. And I did pay a lot of attention to my writing in general in A Day of Fallen Night, which sounds silly because, obviously I always pay attention to my writing. I'm a writer, but I suppose writing The Priory of the Orange Tree, it felt like it had unlocked a different stage of my writing. And I'm always challenging myself to try to improve and refine my writing. So what I did with this one is I started really thinking about rhythm in a way I had never thought before. And that meant a lot of the time I was reading the book out to myself and just tweaking sentences multiple times, just trying to get the correct meter, almost like a poem. So the whole book for me is supposed to read a bit like a lost oral story, like something that has been conveyed orally and through poetry and rhyming. And it isn't necessarily that the lines rhyme. In fact, I try to avoid that, but it's just about the rhythm of it, essentially. And that very much applies to the love scenes as well.
I mean, you honor that with the Sappho quote that you include before,
oh, yes.
Which I freaked.
I was so happy I got to include that. Like, as soon as I knew what I was going to do with this book, I knew that Sappho quote was coming into it, because that is pretty much, I think, my favorite quote of all time from any writer. I just love it so much. And it was so appropriate for that particular moment of the book. And also I just had to. Sappho, it's a sapphic book. I had to do it.
I have a Sappho tattoo, like a bust of Sappho, and the fragment says "You burn me," which
that's cool.
could be a bit Priory for sure. So another theme that was so apparent, and that you've already addressed a little bit, is that theme of chosen family. We see this so strongly with Wolfe, with like his fellow soldiers in the King of Heroth's retinue, or retainer. What's the word? Retinue.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're the English major. I'm not. And then his own family with his two dads and his siblings. Also, we see it between the connection with Sabrin and Unora and Glorian and Dumai, which you never really are like, this is who they're talking to. It's always like very alluded to. So I think I'm right.
You're right. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So that part was so interesting to me. I'd love to know how you conceptualize this connection forming, and what was it related to? How did it work? And how was Canth able to intercept?
So I don't want to go into too much detail about Sterren, because it's supposed to be quite mysterious. And I did agonize over it when I wrote the book. I'm like, how much do I explain this kind of magic? Because most of the characters do not really know about it, even Dumai. And Dumai, I say, because she has Sterren magic in her. She's kind of like the Sterren equivalent of being a mage in the Priory. I kind of call them enchantresses in my head when they use Sterren. It might not be the official name in the books, but that's what I call them in my head. It's mages and enchanters. So Dream Connection, I really wanted to play with the idea of dreams a bit more in A Day of Fallen Night, because we know that there is a dream-based magic in the books, because in Priory, Caliber forces Sabran to have these really frightening dreams. So that meant that there was a dream-based magic in the books. And I was just fascinated by the idea of a dream connection. It was slightly inspired by when I was at university. I studied a genre of poetry called the dream vision. And there's one by an anonymous poet who could be the same poet who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but it's called the Pearl Poem. And a man essentially finds himself in this kind of dreamlike landscape, and he sees a woman across a river, or a girl. I can't remember specifically how old she's described as being, and he basically has this conversation with her across this kind of heavenly river. And it always stuck in my head, that particular poem, and that ended up how I designed the dream space that Dumai and Glorian occupy, that they're standing opposite this stream. And yeah, it was, I don't want to go into too much detail, because it's something I would go into in the other books. Specifically, the book I would like to eventually write about Clearlind and Caliber and Niporo, because Caliber in particular has a huge command over Sterren magic, and I think it would be interesting for the reader to have all these questions answered as they learn about it with her. And of course, that is why she, in her form as Cantha, telepathy can interfere with the dream connection. But yeah, I will definitely come back to that, especially if I write, I would like to write a sort of sequel-ish to A Day of Fallen Night. And what that would do is A Day of Fallen Night looks at what happens when Sidon or fire magic goes out of control. I would really like to write a sort of sequel, because after the Grief of Ages, Sterren magic became chaotic for a time. And I think that could be a really interesting point to explore the dream magic and the other side of this magic system, because Sterren does not come from the earth. Like Sidon comes from the core of the world, whereas Sterren is unearthly magic, and therefore for me is more mysterious and frightening, because it literally does not come from earth in the way that humans do. So when humans wield it, it is a particularly dangerous and slippery kind of magic that is harder to control. So I'll definitely come back to you on that.
Okay, we'll put a pin. We'll revisit this in 2 years or however long it takes.
Oh, that's optimistic.
No, I know. With how long it took to take A Day of Fallen Night.
Yeah.
No pressure. So also, I mean, it's so clear. Oh, my keyboard smacked. It's so clear that with this book, you are writing it from a more queer and sapphic perspective. There's so much more that's explicitly stated with a lot of the side characters as well. I loved seeing like Wolf's two dads, and the inclusion of more queer and trans characters, especially in like the royal court with like consorts and doctors and the astronomer, or no, not the astronomer, the alchemist.
The alchemist, yes,
Yeah.
Master Kiprin. He was fun.
And you use really interesting gender neutral medieval style language. How did you come up with the terms like mastress and lady?
That was really hard, I've got to admit, because I really wanted them to feel organic. And of course, whenever you use a new word, it is always going to feel a bit jarring for a while. And I knew that was going to be the case, and I was happy with that, because I know that fantasy readers are used to digesting new terms. But I really didn't want them to stick out like I wanted them to feel like they had always been really baked into this world, and that they were in the same they had developed in the same way as like master and mistress had, for example, which is why I ended up going with the combination route, essentially. I did play with kind of creating very different words, but again, it just felt like the non-binary characters were sticking out too much, and like they were obviously being marked as different if the etymology was just completely far away from the other words. So I ended up doing, like you say, mastress as a gender neutral alternative to master and mistress. And then I did laid. That was probably the harder of the two. Like mastress came to me quite early. It just kind of rolled off my tongue. Laid, I played with tons of different alternatives for that, and they kept getting very close to existing words as well. Like I was like, what about layered? And then I was like, oh no, that's a Scottish title. Like I can't use that. So I went with laid in the end, because I like that it has the beginning of lady, but it also has the hard D sound like the end of Lord. So yeah, that it seemed like a good thing to do, and that it was just ended up being combination seemed like the best way to go. And then obviously you have the gender neutral terms like companion in a marriage. Those are carried over from the Priory of the Orange Tree. I have a few gender neutral ruler terms as well. In that case, I didn't want to do the combination. I have seen like the combination term, it's queen, I think, for a gender neutral ruler. That didn't quite work for me, so I decided to just create terms like the Lacian ruler is just called high ruler, for example. But yeah, I thought that was an important thing to do, because it's something I had not really thought about that much in the Priory of the Orange Tree. You know, my learning about the community is always broadening, and at the time I just hadn't really considered the idea of bringing in gender neutral language. But I think it's a good thing to do. And you know, queendom seemed like an unusual word to use when I first started using that, and then by the time I'd used it for about the 10th time, I didn't even think about it. So I think it is important that we normalize this kind of language if we can.
Yeah, I love that, since you know the medieval language is so patriarchal and you know centered around men, to inject you know terms like laid and masteress. Like it felt natural reading it.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it felt really nice to be like, oh, like these people could have existed and these were the titles that they could have used.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that, I mean, it's interesting because that in a way, the Anglo-Saxons actually did have a gender neutral term for a person, and that was man, which is why we still say mankind, because it was at one point gender neutral. And what basically you described women as weithman. I'm probably mispronouncing these, but weithman was a woman, and a wereman was a man. And the only way that term has survived is obviously in werewolf, which means man wolf. But at some point, the were was dropped, and a male human was described as being a man, and a woman was still described as being weithman, which means that the word woman essentially it marks us as not being the default, because at some point man was decided to be the default human, and that is linked to the idea of being male. So I found that really interesting when I learned about it at university, because you could have just said man in Anglo-Saxon England and it would have referred to just a person. So yeah, just a little language fact there.
I you learn something new every day and it angers you. Um, okay, so like this is kind of what we already addressed with the themes of like not wanting to be a mother. So the Priory, Sabrin, Tuva, Espar, of course, Tuva and Espar, they desired to have a child and made that choice for themselves. Um, Dumai, Glorian, with their positions in royalty, kind of have the dilemma of Glorian, I don't want to have a kid. Dumai being like, well, I'm also gay, so I don't want to, do the things to produce a child.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then same with Tuva and Espar, they're like, I want to be a mother, but I also don't really want to do the things to produce a child. So I'm going to do this with like a trusted friend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the Priory universe, do you see queerness as a threat to monarchy in the long term?
Oh, yes. I mean, in a way, the books are a huge criticism of hereditary monarchy, which I find to be a fairly ridiculous concept on the whole. I mean, I remember when Kate Middleton married Prince William here, and just the speculation immediately about when she was going to have the heir and the spare. And I just found it profoundly dehumanizing, really. I'm amazed that the system has lasted so long, to be honest. Um, but yeah, it was important to me to explore that in a lot of depth, and about how hereditary monarchy does not really intersect with a lot of modern ideals, and it has issues of bodily autonomy, does have issues when you think about queerness. So yeah, in a way, the whole series is me criticizing that. While I have seen people saying like, oh, perhaps she agrees with monarchy because most of her characters are royal in some way, but often they're royal because I want to explore the subject and to get as close to it as possible, especially through characters like Glorian, to show you the terrible effect of that pressure on her. And A Day of Fallen Night was particularly fun with this one because I got to introduce a republic, the Republic of Carmentum, which is unfortunately destroyed by the time of the Priory of the Orange Tree, which I see as being one of the great tragedies of the world's history, because they had this monarchy this republic that was thriving. And you can see there's a scene in A Day of Fallen Night where the Republicans send representatives to Innis, and you can see the terrible threat it poses to Queen Sabran and King Bardholt. And there's a very tense scene where King Bardholt has this mini debate with one of the Republicans, where she's clearly saying like that she thinks his way of thinking is profoundly outdated, but Bardholt has his own way of thinking about it. And that was unusual for me because I had to fit myself into the mindset of a king and a monarchist, and essentially argue in favor of monarchy in a way that I don't personally agree with. So Bardholt, like Glorian, questions her father and says, why does it have to be like this? Why didn't you just create a republic? And Bardholt is saying, well, yes, you can give the people books, but what if the books are wrong? And like, yes, you can give them teachers, and what if the teachers are wrong? So it has to be me. I'm the king, and I take full responsibility for my whole country. So I had to figure out a way to argue it in a way that might sound persuasive to Glorian, while also completely disagreeing with Bardholt on a personal level. But yeah, so that is in a way the point of this series, is kind of the slow deconstruction of the idea of hereditary monarchy. And another way I did this was through the House of Nurziken, which is Dumai's dynasty. And I knew that this was the book where her house was going to fall, because it is established in Priory that they fell. But the way that this happened, I had to think about the most effective way to that in order to tackle the theme of hereditary monarchy and what I personally felt about it. And there's a line or a paragraph, in fact, where the Grand Empress, Dumai's grandmother, talks about the end of her house. And she says something like, a house that crushes its own daughters beneath its foundations is no house at all. And she sees that, Dumai did not want to have children, and had she had children, it would likely have been profoundly traumatic for her. And the Grand Empress realizes that that was wrong. And even if Dumai and Nikea obviously hatch this plan where they're going to get married and they're going to raise Suzumai to be a stronger empress, but then they would have just passed on the burden to Suzumai. And what if she had not wanted to have children either? So it's this endless dilemma. And eventually the Grand Empress is like, well, that's just wrong, isn't it? So she just kind of gives up, and she says, you know what, I accept defeat. Let's just try to do something different in future. It doesn't quite work out like that, unfortunately. It doesn't, Seiki does not instantly become a highly progressive republic, but I didn't think that it would after being ruled for, over a millennium by an imperial house. I didn't think they could fit into a highly anti-monarchist structure straight away. And in Priory, you see that they are still working on a pretty hereditary system, but at least the Grand Empress tried. And yeah, so I did a lot of thinking about that in this book.
I mean, happy coronation month.
Thanks. Oh dear, I forgot it was happening. Like, I was in Australia, and we were at a convention, and the driver kind of called over her shoulder, "Do I hear a British accent back there?" And I was like, "Yes, that's me." And she said, "Oh, happy coronation month." I was like, I've literally forgotten that was happening. And then I figured out there were Union Jacks all over the place, but it did take me a minute.
Yeah, when I was visiting, I was like, oh my God, there's so much riffraff. This is just a silly place full of silly people. I mean,
we are
we are arguably worse. So, different.
Sure.
So, okay, I have some logistical confirmation questions. So we don't have to go too deep into this. You can just kind of be like, yep, you're right. No, you're wrong. Short explanation if you feel compelled. So some of us read Glorian as asexual. Thoughts?
Yes. She's certainly supposed to be on the ace spectrum, or that's how I wrote her. I used to always confirm exactly what sexuality I thought my characters were. I'm thinking I should perhaps not do that as frequently now, because I do like readers to be able to be free to interpret the characters in their own way. But certainly from my perspective, Glorian is on the ace spectrum, yes.
Amazing. Okay, so we have Wolf and Glorian as the parents to baby Sabrin. So she has the blood of both Cleland and Gallian. Will, or not the blood, the powers, and she has the Sidon and the the blood of Gallian. So there's like the enemies converging into this one little baby.
Yeah.
Will there be a Sabrin from like more later down the line in the Priory universe that has mage blood powers?
Well, I mean, mage powers in the book are woken by the fruit of the tree or any of the seed and trees. So this you see this in Nicaea's bloodline actually, because at the end of the book or near the end, we find out that Nicaea is essentially from what I might call an extinguished mage bloodline, in that she has mage blood from Neporo and the mulberry tree. Well, she's not descended from Neporo, but she's descended from someone who was given the fruit by Neporo. But basically, because the mulberry tree is dead, Nicaea's bloodline is no longer able to spark their magic. So they still have what I might call passive abilities. And you see this in Wolf. So Wolf has never eaten the fruit, but Wolf survives falling into the ashen sea because he has this little spark of sedum that keeps him just warm enough to stay alive. So basically, it's a combination. I wanted it to be kind of an egalitarian form of magic, I suppose. So you can inherit it in that you can inherit the ability, you can inherit kind of this passive sedum, and that means that the tree will willingly yield its fruit to you if you have some influence of the magic in your blood. However, you can just take the fruit, no matter who you are. If you climb that tree and take the fruit and eat it, you'll get it. It's a kind of mix of an inherited power, but also a one that you can take for yourself. So theoretically, if baby Sabran at some point in her life was to be presented with a piece of sedum fruit, she could become a mage, as could anyone who eats sedum fruit. But she does have that underlying power in her blood. I am tempted to write about Sabran because she had a very interesting and tragic life. Which I think is hinted at towards the end of A Day of Fallen Night, when you see in the epilogue Glorian realizing that she is going to have to repeat the cycle of hereditary monarchy again, because she's too afraid of what if the Berethnet legacy is true, and what if Sabran doesn't have a baby, what if the Nameless One rises, and then all of this destruction and chaos will happen again. So, and Sabran ended up having a very unhappy marriage to Heinrich Vatten, who was the person that Glorian's cousin wanted to betroth her to, and she was betrothed to him, and she did marry him when she was older. But she did not want to be with him because Sabran was a lesbian and she had fallen in love with her lady in waiting, which did eventually have a happy ending, because there was a rule during the time of the Grief of Ages. There was a rule that queens were not supposed to remarry unless they had not had a child during their first marriage, because there was this idea that your dead companion will be waiting for you in Haugaland, which is like the Innish equivalent of heaven. So it's going to be kind of awkward if you turn up in Haugaland with two partners, because that's not done in the Innish culture. But Glorian ended up fighting to overturn this rule for her daughter's sake, and she was successful in doing that. So I think that could be interesting to explore, and it's why I'm kind of tempted to write some kind of follow-up, though it would still be as standalone as possible. But I think it would be really fascinating to explore that period, especially because the character of Sabran the Seventh is calling to me, because yeah, I think in my head, she was this incredibly kind and sort of compassionate and introverted woman, but she was called Sabran of the Sorrows because she was always known to be sad, because the Innish saw her as having like the stain of the Grief of Ages on her. There was like this cloud that always kind of hung over her, because we know the Berethnet queens are prone to hereditary depression, and Sabran was one of the ones who got that.
Damn, you've thought about this.
Oh, I really have. Well, in order to create the line of the Berethnet queens and to know which number Sabran in the first book was going to be, I had to figure out, what number Sabran is this woman. So if she's Sabran the ninth, I had to go back in history and figure out how many.
And Glorian Sabran is 7.
So Glorian's mother is the 6th and her daughter is 7th. Yes, they're named after she's named after her grandmother, which is even more confusing. But yeah, so I had to go back and figure out how many Sabrans and Marians and Gillians there were. And then while I was doing that, I kind of wrote like a couple of sentences at least so that I had some historical figures to talk about in Priory. So that I have a little document of all of their lives. But yeah, Sabran 7th is an interesting one.
I would love to just have like a kind of how what's his name, George R. R. Martin published like the
The
history of
World of Ice and
American.
Fire, right?
Like that for Priory, like the whole
That's the
like
dream. That's the
yeah.
dream. Maybe when I finish the cycle, I can see if Bloomsbury might do like the guide to the roots of chaos, and I can talk
Uh,
about some of the like I mean, there's the Berethnic queens, and also some of the other dynasties had really interesting leaders. Like my reads the diary of Queen Nirai, who was like another Sakonese dragon rider queen. So I think she could be interesting to talk about. Lots of very interesting Lacian rulers, like all the way back to Situ the Dreamer. So that would be an exciting thing to do.
I I'm so excited and I hope it happens.
Me
Um,
too.
okay, so you wrote a lot of this during the pandemic, and I was wondering if the use of masks against the plague was a COVID reference.
This I cannot even explain to you my feelings when I realized there was an actual real life pandemic while I was writing this book, because and I will always hold to this.
Right?
It wasn't inspired by COVID, and I can prove it because the Priory of the Orange Tree mentions the draconic plague, and that was before COVID. So it was not inspired by COVID.
You
However,
you caused it. You
I
wrote
know it.
existence.
I could not believe it, because I was sitting in my house, all on my own, because I don't live with anyone, and like the early rules of the pandemic, you just weren't allowed to see anyone at all. So I was sitting there kind of working on this novel about a pandemic, and I thought, oh God, absolutely everyone is now going to think that was inspired by COVID. And fortunately, I think most people have understood that it wasn't. It was actually mostly inspired by the Black Death.
Ah,
In fact, most people I've spoken to who were writing a pandemic book at the time just happened to be writing something about the Black Death, and it just coincided with COVID. But yeah, I will admit that there was a couple of lines about masks in the book that I don't think it's possible to say that those weren't slightly inspired by COVID,
yeah.
especially when poor Mistress Bourne is desperately trying to get people to understand that
Yeah.
when there is a pandemic, we don't spit on things all the time. There's a slightly ridiculous scene where he they come in and basically are holding this kind of piece of fur, and they're like, what, why was someone spitting on this? And Floral is like, that's how it's refreshed. Like, this isn't a completely insane thing to do. So yeah, I can't say that wasn't a
Yeah.
tiny bit
The
inspired by the
humor,
pandemic.
the humor that you infuse with Mistress Bourne, I was just like cackling at like it was just like slapstick at certain points. Just loved
Yeah,
it.
I really liked the idea of a very modern-minded doctor being stuck in Innis, which is very dark ages in its approach to medicine. So Mistress Bourne is just constantly in a state of minor fury over it. So that was fun.
Yeah. And then okay, so there's the Lady in the Woods. We see Lord Robart doing this like very midsummer-esque ritual, in the woods behind Wolf's house. What was the religious inspo behind this piece?
Oh, well, it's mostly inspired by the approach of Christianity to paganism. I
Yeah.
was always very interested in how Christianity derided paganism, but also appropriated various pagan rituals and the dates. For example, the Christian calendar is kind of often modeled on the more pagan calendars. So that was the main inspiration. Virtuedom and the religion of the six virtues of knighthood is very much inspired by Christianity, and particularly the Church of England. Like I said, I was raised Christian. I was primarily raised Anglican, Church of England, but also with some Catholic and Methodist influence from my grandparents. And a lot of that went into the book, especially because the Roots of Chaos series was inspired by the legend of Saint George and the Dragon, which is obviously a very Christian story. And yeah, so it interested me, the idea of this conflict between the older religion of Innis and the new religion that was created by Gallian. And so the scene where Lord Robart is in the woods, and there's this dialogue that happens afterwards where Glorian is discussing it with her counselors, and they say, oh, he was dressed as if to mock a Sanctarian. And so he's wearing these clothes that resemble the clothes of a Sanctarian of Virtuedom, which is like a priest.
Yeah.
But of course, he's not mocking it. What's actually happening is that the Sanctarian's clothing was based on the clothing that he is wearing. It's
Ah.
so they're basically accusing him of mocking something when actually the religion of the six virtues has appropriated the clothing that was worn in those rituals originally. So yeah, mostly inspired by Christianity and paganism.
Religious trauma is so fun, isn't it?
Yeah, you really see it a lot in the books. This is definitely me
We read a lot
working
of
through.
religious trauma related books, and as an ex Episcopalian myself, it's super fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in a lot of my work.
Okay, so what happened to Heroth and the North in Priory? Because we don't really see it that much.
Oh, I just don't. It's not that anything's happened to them. It's just that I just don't think I had the space, really. I mean, I remember my editors kind of making this sudden realization about halfway through editing Priory, because obviously the different chapter titles switch between West, East, and South. And one of my editors suddenly went, hang on, where's North? I was like, there is a North, we're just not going there.
It's just not there right now.
Yeah, I guess the book was already so big and I hadn't specifically planned like a
Yeah.
cross storyline for that book, so we didn't get one. But it did seem relevant in Priory because I knew that Glorian was the daughter of the king of Hroth, and therefore it was going to be much more prominent. And I really loved getting to explore Hroth. It was so much fun. I based it kind of roughly on Iceland and Norway, and I just really enjoyed exploring that setting, and especially liked looking at the conflict between the original religion of Hroth as well, because they had a similar-ish religion to the Inish, what we might call pagans, but theirs was based on the lakes, and the lakes that basically when lakes freeze over, they make the most incredible sound. Like another author I was talking to said that in her, I think she's from Alaska, and her family calls it dark thunder. And it's just this, if you type into Google something like, I don't know, something like ice cracking music or something like that, it's just this very scary, haunting, oddly beautiful sound, because when the ice cracks, it sends these sounds through the water. And I thought to myself, okay, well, if you have a country with a lot of frozen lakes and they're hearing this sound, they're probably going to interpret it as being something supernatural. So there's this idea that there are these ice spirits underneath the ice that are constantly trying to get out, and they have to be appeased all the time. And I really enjoyed thinking about how Barthold might have been affected by that, because he's a character who that religion was not working for, because his family was considered to have been touched by the ice spirits because his sister was born with like a white streak in her hair, and the Hrothi interpreted that as being a sign that she was somehow marked by the ice spirits. So that religion wasn't working for Barthold. But then I really enjoyed getting to write Sabran, figuring that out and manipulating Barthold into marrying her and converting, because she realizes that he's very similar to Gallian in some ways, because Gallian was also in a country that had a religion that was more based on nature. And Barthold's very similar to him, so she manages that very well, and that was very fun to write.
We need a encyclopedia for this series because there's so like, especially the religious aspect and like the magic aspect I'm so interested in. So I'm putting it here right now. Please make that for me specifically.
You'll definitely get to hear more about it in other books, because a lot of the series is going to be about exploring the magic system and how it was originally unbalanced and the consequences of that in various ways.
Okay, so we get to see the origin of the Island of Dragon Riders, Feather Island, with Nikea honoring Dumai. Is she dead? What happened to her in the end of the book? What happened?
I thought I was being so unsubtle with that, but apparently a lot of people really do think Dumai is dead, which is very, very interesting.
Okay, yeah, no, I thought she was dead. I was like, she's gone. And everyone's like, no, she's a spirit. She's like a ghost of the water now. Please, could you clarify?
Well, I'm not sure how much I want to clarify, because again, I like to leave it to the reader's imagination to some extent, but I would read very carefully the conversation that Dumai has with Pajati, who is the white dragon who comes to her after she falls. And it is written in a deliberately cryptic way. First of all, because dragons are cryptic, as Dumai spends the entire book agonizing over. They just will not speak plainly at all. They're constantly speaking in riddles. But I also wanted, again, to leave it to the reader's imagination, but I very much do not see Dumai as being dead. And
I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna reread.
I honestly thought I was being really obvious, but maybe not. So I'll lean into that. I did want to leave a bit of mystery because I knew that I had to establish in this book that in the Priory of the Orange Tree, it says that the House of Nuziken fell after the Grief of Ages. So I had to have it ostensibly that the whole house, other than the Grand Empress, falls. Because if the problem is that if Dumai had survived or had visibly survived in any case, there would have been a civil war because half of them would have been for the River Lord and half of them would have been for her. And she did not want that to happen because her country had already been through this hellish situation with the Grief of Ages. And she doesn't want that to happen again. She doesn't think Sayiki can bear any more war. So knowing that, if she had survived, she would not want to make that very clear or broadcast it to anyone. But she might want to let Nikea know that she was still alive. And that is all I'm going to say.
I'm gonna email you and we're gonna circle back on this.
Just read it really carefully and read it with an eye that I'm trying to confuse you.
Okay, got it. All right, so the worm animals. They're like, you bring in all of these different like deer and oxes and horses and all of these that they're like zombies.
Yeah.
Like products of the worms. How does that work? Do they get bitten by the dragons? Does the dragon magic just infect them with do they like cough on them or something? Like how does that work in creation in your mind?
So I had to think about this quite carefully, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to commit it to the books because it almost sounds too ridiculous and grotesque, and I'm not totally sure that any of the characters would reasonably be able to find out unless they really followed a wyvern around. But basically, the wyverns devour the animal, and then they are able to basically somehow in their bodies kind of engineer them into something else, and then they lay an egg containing that something else. So they're kind of digesting them, but also making something else. I don't really know how it works. It's just magic. But that's basically what happens. The animal gets devoured and kind of changed somehow.
So all of the animals, like cows that they said were disappearing, were eaten by the worms and then laid as eggs. Where they're zombies.
Yeah, basically, something goes on inside the wyvern. They're kind of these like strange creatures that can combine elements of a wyvern with the kind of organic tissue that they're absorbing, and then they turn them into these slightly hellish creatures, most of which are in some way based on animals from mythology or from medieval bestiaries. And I just thought that would be quite an interesting dynamic because mostly the wyverns are going to be airborne, so they're going to need some kind of foot soldiers. And it made sense to me. And it also meant that I could have tons of really cool creatures in the books.
We're going to need like a scientist to dissect a wyvern in a future book just to see.
Help me understand how this could happen. This is why I haven't put it in the books because I'm not even sure if it's. I mean, it's fantasy. It's fantasy. It's fine. Like it's magic. It's all good. There is the wyverns are invented, and I'm sure it could happen somehow. So, but that's essentially what I imagine is happening.
Okay, so this is my last. I know we're slightly over time. Thank you for already agreeing to be a little over time with us. So this is my last question for myself, and then we're going to move into the like super rapid fire round, short questions, short answers, and then for everyone on the call that may have a question for Samantha, drop them in the chat. We'll ask if we have time at the end. Okay, so what is next? You have is the plan still three prequels and a sequel to Priory? Did writing A Day of Fallen Night change or inspire your plan for the Roots of Chaos series in any way?
Um, well, yes. I mean, I knew I wanted to write more after I wrote A Day of Fallen Night. And I was very fortunate that because of the level of support the Roots of Chaos has had, Bloomsbury were very willing to expand the series. I am being quite strict on only selling them one at a time because they're such huge undertakings. They take about 3 years to both write and edit. And especially when I still have the Bone season ongoing, I don't want to tie myself into a long schedule for those books. If I had like 3 of them on contract, I would be tied into a deadline schedule. And I think that would just be incredibly stressful with books of that size. So I've decided to just sell them one at a time. But yes, ideally, I would like to write, I think 5 on overall is probably the right number. So again, I've got this idea for a sequel to A Day of Fallen Night, which would explore the wild winter that Glorian mentions, or Glorian's aunt even mentions in the epilogue, which I think would be really interesting, like exploring a period of like cold and strangeness that came after the grief of ages. Then I would like to write the Neporo Clearland Caliber book that would show you how the magic system became unbalanced in the first place. There are quite a lot of Clearland Neporo Caliber hints that we see in A Day of Fallen Night. For example, we see that Clearland is strangely preserved in her coffin, and we might have seen Neporo. I will not say precisely where, but I'm sure some people have figured it out. And we also, of course, see Caliber in the form of Canthi. So they're all very much around. And I think it would be very fun to write a book that is just focused on them and also shows you what really happened with Galleon and Clearland. And because there's so much about storytelling and how history has changed over time, I think it'd be very interesting for the reader to see just the pure truth of what happened during that period and the early days of the Priory. So I'd like you to meet like Siati, for example, who's the ancestor of Esbar and Eid and Siu, because she was a very fiery figure who I think would be very interesting to hang out with. Then I have a kind of one that I'm like in two minds about writing, which is what I call the very ancient Priory book, which would go right the way back to characters like Sutu the Dreamer, who are very old figures in the world of the books. And I'm still toying with the idea of doing that, so that's my maybe one. And then I would like to tie it all off by writing a sequel to The Priory of the Orange Tree, which would look at how do we get the magic system back in balance after all of this chaos and strife that our world has gone through. How are we going to fix this? And I think it would definitely be really interesting. I'd like to give a bigger role to Tanne in that book. I would like to have Firadel as the uncontested villain again, because I absolutely love Firadel. He's just hugely fun for me. I love even getting to write his dialogue in A Day of Fallen Night was so much fun, because I was thinking, how would this dragon speak? And I had a great time with that. So that's my loose plan for however far in the future that will be. I'm not going to write another Roots of Chaos book for a little while, because A Day of Fallen Night was really hard because it's so long. It took it out of me. And also because I want to concentrate on the Bone Season series for a while, because the readers of the Bone Season series have had to watch the gaps between the books get longer and longer because I've been cheating on them with the Dragon book. So I want to write book 5 and book 6 before I write another Roots of Chaos book, and then I can take my time a bit with book 7, which will be the last book in the series.
Mm-hmm. Let's not forget the Sabrin the Seventh book, though. Please continue to.
That would probably be involved somehow in the sequel to A Day of Fallen Night. I mean, I don't really know how I would handle the timeline in that. Like maybe I could do like a very extended timeline, perhaps, and that could involve the slightly older Sabrin. But yeah, we'll see.
Okay. Oh, I'm so excited, and totally understand that the Bone Season people need to, have their moment as well. And I'm very excited to get started with that series and have so many books to read while I wait for the next Roots of Chaos.
See, my thing is like I want the Priory readers to become Bone Season readers, and then everyone is happy.
Great strategy. Okay, so rapid fire.
Mm-hmm.
If you could live anywhere in the Priory world, where would you live?
Oh, I've been asked this before and I still haven't decided. It's so hard. Because there's so many really beautiful parts of the Priory world. I think it's probably a toss-up between Cross, although it might be a bit cold. The Priory itself, like I think is a very beautiful kind of
Yeah.
idyllic place in some ways. And maybe Seiki, because I really like bioluminescence, and there are a lot of bioluminescent things in Seiki.
I would have the same answer. Those are the two that I toss up between. If you could go on a quest with any of the Priory or A Day of Fallen Night characters, who would be on your team?
Esbar, 100%.
Yeah, she's
I feel I
yeah.
feel like Esbar by herself would probably be a sufficient like person to go with because she's just an army in one woman. I love her. Yeah, Esbar, Eid, Wolf, pretty good fighter right there. I guess Tanuva because we would need. I feel like well, Tanuva's
Can't
also an
leave us far.
amazing warrior, but she's also a compassionate person, so she could be the nice one of the group. And Tanne.
Yeah, I love that. If you could have any character from Priory meet any character from A Day of Fallen Night, who would it be and why?
Mm, wow, that's another tough one because there's so many I could think of. I think Esbar and Eve would be a fun combination because they're related, and I think they could both agonize over their experiences with Canthi slash Caliber because they both
You're
had
like
run-ins with her.
this bitch again.
I know, and I was laughing because after writing A Day of Fallen Night and thinking about Caliber's confrontation with Ede and thinking in her head she was probably like, oh no, God, it's Esbos descendant is back to haunt me.
Yeah.
I think they would make an iconic team, and also Gloria and Sabrin the Ninth, because I feel like Glorian would be shouting at her like, just stop the hereditary monarchy, it's pointless. But Glorian didn't stop it herself, so I think that would be like a sad meeting, but a necessary one.
Yeah. Dragon Rider or Ichneumon Rider, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
It's Ichneumon.
Ichneumon.
Oh, that's really hard because dragons are really cool, but Ichneumons are really cute. Like I loved getting to spend more time with the Ichneumons in A Day of Fallen Night. Like they're just so adorable. And I decided that I was gonna make them all have the same personality, which I just thought was hilarious. Like I was thinking, I'm not going to distinguish them at all. I'm just going to have them all have exactly the same personality, and they
Oh,
all
so
share the same wisdom.
yeah.
So that was really fun. Yeah, I guess I'm gonna have to say dragon just because it would be cool to fly, but I would be really sad not to have an Ichneumon.
Yeah. Okay, so would you rather live in the Day of Fallen Night era or the Priory era?
Oh, Priory. Day of Fallen Night is the worst period of time that you could have been alive in Priory's world. You've got the plague, you have the dragons, there's a volcano going off the whole time. There's
Yep.
all the crops are dying because that's happening. Like nothing is good. Definitely Priory.
Okay, what are you currently reading?
Oh, I am. What am I currently reading? Oh, I'm reading Feybound by Sarah El-Arifi, which has just been announced. So it's not really out there on Goodreads or anything. Actually, it is on Goodreads, but it doesn't have a cover or anything yet. But so Sarah is the author of The Final Strife, which is an amazing sapphic fantasy, which everybody should read. And this is another sapphic fantasy. And it's about like fae and elves, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I think it's coming out early next year, I feel like. But yeah, you should read Sarah's other series. It's really good.
Good. What is a book that you recommend everyone read?
Oh man, there's so many. What is just one I could narrow it down to? I'm not even sure. One of my favorite authors of the past few years is Ava Reid, who is the author of The Wolf and the Woodsman and Juniper and Thorn. And I think they are both absolutely incredible. Ava writes incredibly lyrically, like their prose just takes my breath away every single time. I would definitely recommend both of those books. What else? Oh, and also The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, which is just a true it's just a true epic. And again, Tasha is a magnificent writer. It's got
I
a
am sure.
absolutely stunning sapphic romance between two very morally grey characters. And I cannot wait for the finale.
You read the Oleander Sword as well?
I have read The Oleander Sword. Yes.
Oh, good.
Incredible.
Um, and then Oh, did you? No, no, no. I asked you that one last time. If you had dinner with anyone dead or alive, who would it be?
Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
As you read out in my bio, I specialized in Emily Dickinson when I was at university, and I'm really fascinated by the fact that she's getting this kind of sapphic renaissance as well, like the fact that we've had shows like Wild Nights with Emily, and now it's weird because when I was at Oxford, I didn't really see that, I guess because I hadn't had my awakening moment yet. But actually reading back on her letters, I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
yes, I think it's quite likely that she was sapphic. And I also am convinced that she had migraines, which I also have. And I really connect to a lot of her work because of that. I just feel like I can see the influence there. So definitely Emily Dickinson.
Oh, I love that. She knew before you knew.
Yes. It's like I was the only person pretty much to choose to specialize in her because she's like notoriously quite difficult in terms of a lot of her work is quite hard to interpret. But I'm very glad I did. I was clearly drawn to her for a reason.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go into the chat for the remainder of the questions. So Thomas says, "Hi Samantha, met you at the St. Louis stop of your A
Oh,
Day of
hi.
Tour, and I finished the first draft of my first fantasy novel. Big slay, Thomas. What helps you write histories of the characters in your world, especially in the lens of royalty and leadership? Asking so I can better write and explain the history of my series world and history in a way that's cohesive yet immersive like yours."
Oh, that's a very big question. Also, hi again, Thomas. I'm just trying to think if there's some easy tips I can give. So, I mean, what I tend to do with the royalty, like I did with the Berethnet Queens, is I basically sat down and figured out a timeline for them. I felt like that was necessary because they were celebrating 1,000 years of Berethnet rule, and I had to figure out how long each queen would have lived and things like that. So a timeline is definitely helpful, and it kind of forces you to think about when these queens would have lived. So for example, if you don't want every single queen to have had the exact same lifespan, for example, so you have to think, oh, if this Berethnet queen died young, then how did she die? Was she murdered or did she die of natural causes? You have to think about that, and that kind of creates its own story as you're trying to figure your way through the timeline. Just trying to think if there's any other tips really. I mean, world building and history is difficult. It's a difficult skill in fantasy writing, I think, because you don't want to overwhelm the reader by doing a huge info dump. And this is part of the reason I rewrote the Bone season, because I was a less skilled world builder 10 years ago. And the original opening chapter is just full of information, and there is too much information and a lot of it is unnecessary. So I think there is an art to seeding the information throughout the book, and you have to think, where would it be pertinent for me to give this piece of information, and is it more likely to help the reader or confuse them? And that's something I did to a very extreme degree when I was looking back at the Bone season, but it's also something I think about with the Roots of Chaos books. So yeah, I would recommend having a timeline. I'd recommend developing at least a few historical characters in a fair amount of detail so that you can mention them and refer to them, which is one of the reasons I did it for the queens in Priory, was because when Ede is walking around court, she's seeing statues of the queens, for example, and some of their life stories are being used to manipulate Sabran, particularly Glorian's life story. So yeah, it's good to develop at least a few of them, I think, and it just helps the world feel a bit richer.
Okay, so coming from a Samsung SM S908W, please share your name in the chat so I know who you are. The specific characters that were eaten by the worms, would they be experiencing this grotesque rebirth? That's a great question.
Like would they be dead or living through it?
Like the way that the worms could make cows zombies, they do that with humans.
Oh, well, I do a couple of very small hints towards that in the books that you might have noticed. So there's a scene, I think it's in the final battle in Nazine, the capital of Lacia. And there's a moment where Tanuva thinks that she sees like part of a human face melded into one of these creatures. And it's supposed to leave you kind of thinking, is Tanuva seeing this, or is she just so panic stricken that she's either misseeing it, or perhaps she's seen a human like nearby and she thinks that they've just kind of overlapped for a second. So I won't specifically confirm or deny, but I will say there is no particular reason that the worms shouldn't do that to humans.
Noted. And thank you, Cassandra, for your question. No need to apologize. You're all good. Um, okay, Thomas, for Roots of Chaos, could Sovereign the Ninth also have dormant Seedin / Starin magic?
Oh yeah, no, she has both. Yeah, in fact, she would be a very powerful mage, I would say, because she's descended from Canthi / Caliber, who was a master of both, is even a master of both kinds of magic. So I think if somebody taught Sabran, she would be an exceptionally powerful mage.
Maybe that will happen.
Well, I did think about it in Priory, because there's obviously the scene where Tanne brings the orange, and I thought,
Yeah.
oh, well, maybe this is the moment for Sabran to become a mage, but I felt that it would be wrong of her to do that because the oranges are sacred to the sisters of the Priory. She is not a member of the Priory, and I think it would have been quite disrespectful of her to just take a massive mouthful of the orange. And I think that she would have known that because she knows how important it is to eat from a religious perspective. But certainly in a theoretical situation in which she was given seed and fruit, which I will not say whether it's going to happen or not, but it's certainly possible, and the tree would 100% answer to her if she went to it.
Amazing. Aurora is asking, when you're writing books, how do you go about researching and then organizing and tying in that research into your books?
So I do what I call overview research first, which is just looking up basic facts about a historical era, and then I try to go into a bit more detail. So I did a lot of historical research for A Day of Fallen Night, even more than I did with Priory, actually, because although Priory is very historically inspired, it's mostly inspired by the 16th and 17th centuries. A Day of Fallen Night is even more historically inspired in that I'm actually expressing certain events that happened during the medieval era through a fantasy lens. So, for example, the destruction of the ship, the Conviction that Sabran and Bardholt are on. You'll notice that the ship is.
Oh,
I
Samantha.
repeatedly say that it is a white ship. Disaster is ship disaster. Oh,
Hello.
did you lose me for? Oh, shoot.
Yes, we lost
Am I
you for a
back?
second. You're back.
Sorry. Yeah, it just flashed up to say my connection was
You're
unstable, whatever that means.
you're so fine. Where we
Um,
lost you was the ship, the Conviction.
Right. So the ship, the Conviction, I say repeatedly that it was a white ship. And the reason for that is because the destruction of the Conviction is based on something called the White Ship Disaster, which was a very key event during the medieval era. So if you want to look that up, you'll see why it's an inspiration. So I do overview research and then I go into more detail. I'm very lucky that I live within a reasonable distance of the British Library, which is an amazing resource. I can get basically any academic text. I can just order it to the library and I can go and sit there and study it for a while. Often I will try to stick to primary sources that were actually written by people at the time because I find those most helpful for creating like an immersive atmosphere. I was very lucky with the Seikini storyline, for example. That's loosely based on the Heian era of Japan, and there's a ton of writing from that era. Also, specifically writing by women, like the first novel in history was written by a woman during that era. So that was an incredible, it was an incredible wealth of stories to have access to. And then I'll do kind of sometimes specific research rabbit holes when I'm looking for a particular detail. So the example I normally give of this, in the Priory of the Orange Tree, I really wanted a character to be wearing a hat, and I really wanted it to be a historically accurate hat. And so I looked up what hats were made of during this particular period of Chinese history. And it ended up taking me several days to establish this. I could not find the detail. And then finally, I can't remember exactly where I found it. I think it was in an academic essay or something, but I found out that hats could be made of otter fur during this period. And this amounts to one single sentence in the book where a character is mentioned as having an otter fur hat. And it's like I spent 3 days on that detail. So I think it is sometimes a good idea to think, what am I trying to get out of this particular research? So I had the very clear aim of finding out how to describe a hat, because otherwise I probably would have gone on an endless rabbit hole about that whole era. So you definitely have to try to control it to some degree, because you could end up just getting lost in research for weeks or months. But yeah, sometimes I like to do in-person research if I can as well. So I did research trips to, various castles and different places that inspired the book. I couldn't do that during the pandemic, which was really frustrating because I wanted to go to Scandinavia for the Hrothi influence, and I also wanted to go to Korea for the Queendom of Seppel. Couldn't do that in either case, so I was restricted to online research for those particular countries. But if I can, I like to be able to travel and visit the place because it often gives me more inspiration.
Love that. And then Thomas asks for the Bone season. How do you feel with the result of the revised anniversary edition, and what extra content could we see?
Oh, I love it so much. Look, I've got it right here. It's so gorgeous. Um, I'm so pleased with it. Like I'm especially because I did the revision in a relatively limited amount of time. And I also did it by myself because only I knew what I wanted to do with the revision. So I didn't have a professional editor working on it with me. I did it myself. And Bloomsbury were not expecting the revision to be this intense. So the amount of time I had been set aside for a light revision, and I ended up doing this incredibly detailed one. I'm thrilled with it. I've really worked very hard to make it a much more accessible beginning to the series. So the world building is more refined. I've stripped out a few small details that just didn't end up going anywhere in the series, and I was so much younger when I wrote it. I've done a lot of character work to try to make Paige's arc a lot clearer. There's a couple of bonus scenes which are really fun to write. There's also the timeline. There was no timeline in the original Bone season. It's so confusing. Like I was reading it and I could not tell what day it was at any time. And like there's a scene where Paige is the main character and she gets arrested and taken to this dystopian version of Oxford. She's been there 2 days, and the way she's talking, it's like she's been there for weeks, and it's so confusing. And I don't think I knew what day it was in the book. So, and that really came across. So yeah, the timeline is now way more established, and that meant I could free up a bit of space for bonus scenes. Warden, who's the kind of love interest slash deuteragonist, his arc is much clearer as well. He's also like, there were a couple of moments in the original, because I was much younger and I had some slightly odd ideas about what was sexy, and now those weird bits are gone, which is nice. And yes, just a couple of moments where I was like, "Ooh, that seems creepy," which really did a disservice to his character because he's not like that at all. But I think I was just writing to this idea that I had to. I don't know what was going through my head, to be honest. I was not in the best place at the time. But yeah, I'm very, very, very pleased with it, and it's gone from being my least favorite of my books to being in my top 3. Like that's the difference that I've managed to create. And also the design is so stunning. Bloomsbury have hired the same guy who does the Priory covers, and he has just created a masterpiece in this cover. It is so beautiful and so vibrant. It's the first time the Bone season's had a cover that I feel like really nails the atmosphere of the series. And also Emily Facchini, who does the chapter headers in all of my books, including the Priory books. She has done new maps and has also done these beautiful like illustrations for the different sections of the book. And I think it's just going to look absolutely stunning when it's finished. I'm so excited.
Oh my God, that will absolutely be my first Bone season reading
Yes.
experience. I can't wait.
Yes, for anyone who has not read the Bone season series, please wait for the anniversary edition. It's coming out in August. You will not miss anything from the original. It's just a much better version of it that you're likely to enjoy.
All right, we have last question from Kaja. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. What is the best tip for an aspiring writer?
So this is going to sound controversial, but it's actually not to take too much advice, or don't take it without a pinch of salt. The reason I say that is because I have seen some well-meaning advice that I do not think is very good. And I think that if you take advice too much to heart, it can sometimes work against you. So the main example I give is that I once saw a very famous writer say that in order to be a writer, you have to write X number of words per day. And I think it was something like 1,000 or 2,000 words per day. I do not write 1,000 words a day. I might very occasionally, but it's a pretty rare occurrence. I sometimes don't write at all every day because I have a chronic illness, I have migraines, and sometimes I can't write for maybe 3 days because of a migraine. So I think that very prescriptive writing advice like that, I think, can be quite harmful. And if you see something like that that makes you feel like you're not a proper writer if you don't fit into it, I would say to definitely take it as a guideline or a suggestion rather than a rule. Just anything like that that says, like, to be a writer, you have to do this. Like, there's so many different ways to be a writer. And obviously, if you have like a full-time job or you have a big family, you're not going to be able to write 1,000 words like clockwork every single day. So just don't worry about it. There's no formula to being a writer. There's things that you can do to help. So for example, I think that you can read a lot if you can. I think that's a great way to become a better writer. I think it improves your vocabulary and it teaches you how to structure stories if you read a lot. But ultimately, it's down to you to decide what kind of writer you want to be and how quickly or slowly you write a book. I'm a lot slower than a lot of my peers are. Some writers just get a book out every single year, some take 10 years, and all of those are okay. And I don't think we should be giving super prescriptive writing advice.
Samantha, thank you so much for spending so much time with our community. This was so much fun. I could listen to you talk for hours about the roots of chaos, and I can't wait to read the Bones season and see what you do next. So let's absolutely stay in touch. And yeah, just thank you so much again. I had so much fun.
Oh no, so did I. It was such a lovely way to spend an afternoon. Thank you very much for having me back.
Of course. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. All right. Bye.